Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. We're all fired up. We're going to be reviewing last week's question periods. They were interesting. Nazigate scandal, all that craziness. It was a pretty wild week. And then on Friday, it would seem like nobody showed up for work. It's a bunch of BS. Anyhow, we're going to jump right into old question period. And here we go.
Questions, questions orales. The honourable member for Thornhill.
Says that it's not his job to control the inflationary spending or the out-of-control cost of living or the sky-high interest rates that he has caused. He says it's not his job to bring down the price of gas, groceries, or home heating. Instead, he's raising the carbon tax. And he says it's not his job to take personal responsibility for our diplomatic relations or to vet the people who come in contact with a wartime leader. He says housing is not his job either. Well, the housing crisis is getting worse. If it's not his job to do anything, any of these things, what is his job?
What is his job, Melissa's asking? What is the Prime Minister's job?
Secretary.
I find it rather rich, Madam Speaker, with all due respect to the member, when that party's leader of the opposition, a responsibility to put forward constructive policy, when he was in opposition, in government, as minister responsible for housing, put forward a plan, $300 million, less than 100 homes built. His plan on housing today is full of holes. He taxed builders, for example. Nothing will get built under his watch, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Do you think anything's going to get built under his watch?
Speaker, they spent almost $90 billion to double the price of a home, to double the price of rent, to double the price of a mortgage in Toronto. It now takes 80% of what Canadians take home to keep a roof over their head. More Liberal spending equals higher inflation, which leads to higher interest rates, which leads to higher mortgages. So how many Canadians have to be in jeopardy of losing their homes before the Liberals stop spending, stop raising taxes, and actually start building homes?
It's a good question. What are we going to do about these inflation rates? It's not working.
Canadians are having a difficult time. That's why during the pandemic we put forward emergency programs that sustain the economy, individuals and families, when that party didn't want to do any of those things. Today we see a government that's put forward a plan to get more homes built. How? In partnership with provinces, with municipalities. That's how we're going to get things done. Not by measures on the other side that instill nothing but fear in the wider Canadian economy and the wider Canadian society. That's not responsible leadership, Madam Speaker.
Is it responsible or is it not?
Home building is actually down just because they have a fancy program or a new acronym every month. It doesn't mean that any of this is working.
Little fire
the
plug
government
this
had
one.
a plan in 2015 to build housing on surplus land. Do you know how many homes they've built since 2015? 13. That's less than 2 a year. Liberal MPs have flipped more houses than that since 2015. It's been 8 years. We need shovels in the ground and not pies in the sky. So will they finally support a common sense conservative plan to actually build homes Canadians can afford?
Common sense. It's a shame she wasn't at yesterday's Finance Committee, Madam Speaker, where witnesses from the Ministry of Finance confirmed that if their idea for housing was to be put in place, less homes would be built compared to our particular plan. It's a plan that takes taxes off. The GST comes off, for example. That incents greater building, Madam Speaker. Combine that with the approach they've taken to municipalities, to provinces, when it comes to ending things like exclusionary zoning. We want to work with those municipalities. We're doing that through the Housing Accelerator Fund.
There's so many empty seats in Parliament on Friday. It's ridiculous.
The Député de Louis Saint-Laurent.
The Honourable Member
Here
for
we go.
Louis Saint-Laurent.
Gerard.
Madam Speaker, 5 long days. For 5 days, the Prime Minister brought the Nazi scandals to headlines all over the world. He hid for 5 days, and he allowed Canada's reputation to be dragged through the mud. When a country is humiliated like this, it is up to the leader of the government to protect its reputation. But what did this Liberal Prime Minister do? He hid. Why?
See why? See if they're going to answer. Jean-Luc Picard, beam me
of
up.
Public Safety. Oh, no, that's not quite right. But thank you, Madam Speaker. The former Speaker of the House, as my colleague knows very well, has clearly stated that he was the only person responsible for having invited this person to the House and for recognizing him. It was his initiative. And no other parliamentarian or the government was involved or informed.
Think that's true?
The former speaker invited his own guests for the speech on Friday, and they were chosen by him and his own office. As soon as we learned about this horrible event that occurred in the House, the Prime Minister recognized that it was very painful for all Canadians and all those who have suffered due to the Holocaust. The honourable member. Madam Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal government, Quebecers are struggling. We learned in the Journal de Montréal that according to a survey, 51% of young Quebecers are living from paycheck to paycheck.
It's a bad number.
And that's not good for anyone, because when youth is traumatized, well, the entire future is at stake for Canada and Quebec. During this difficult time for our youth, what is the genius idea of this Liberal government supported by the Bloc Québécois? Inventing a second carbon tax. Voting for the Bloc has a price. Why does the Liberal Bloc think that this is a good idea? To grab even more money out of the pockets of young Quebecers and to levy a
all
second
the money from the
carbon
Quebec
tax.
kids.
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Here we go. Who do we got? Pablo.
My colleague wants to talk about costs. How much does it cost when our forests burn, when our lakes and rivers flood? How much does destroyed infrastructure cost? What about the price on our children's health when they breathe dirty air?
The most interesting man alive.
Clearly, we don't have the means to put up with a conservative government.
Who do we got here?
Madam Speaker,
Who's this?
Canada's greenhouse gas
Christine
emissions did not
Normandin.
go down last year. Instead, they grew by 2.1%. That's what we've heard from the Climate Institute of Canada. And that's almost entirely due to one sector, where the 5 biggest companies brought in $200 billion in profit last year. A sector that has received billions of dollars in subsidies to pollute less, but it's actually increasing Canada's emissions. And what sector is that? Well, it's oil and gas, of course. When will the government stop filling their pockets with public money? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her question, and I have great news for her. Canada is the first country in the G20 to eliminate subsidies to the oil and gas sector. We're the first country to have done that 2 years before the deadline in 2025. We did that this year, and we are going to eliminate public funding to fossil fuels, and we are the only G20 country to have made that commitment. Canada is fighting climate change, and it's working. We have the best record of any country in the G7 from 2019 and 2021 out of all countries in the G7 for reducing emissions. The Honourable Member, Madam Speaker, 2.1% increase in greenhouse gas emissions due to the oil and gas sector, but the government isn't turning the screws on the sector. Instead, it's giving them more money. Last week, it announced that it wanted to double oil production off Newfoundland. These companies are increasing all of Canada's emissions, but the federal government is actually making it easier for them to pollute even more instead of doing the opposite. When will this government stop being part of the problem?
The carbon tax is a bullshit solution to what we're dealing with here with
The Honourable Minister.
The environment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The wild man,
and I
Simon
would invite
Gabot.
my honourable colleague to read our plan to fight climate change, which environmentalists, scientists, municipalities, the City of Montreal, and many others have all said is a great plan, which shows that, like all other sectors in Canada, the oil and gas sector will have to do its fair share. And that is why we already have a regulation that will reduce methane emissions by at least 40% by 2025. And that is a very serious type of emission. And we also have the Clean Fuel Standard to force gas and diesel producers to reduce the impact.
Here's a good chance, guys, to like and subscribe to the channel if anybody's watching.
Saskatchewan has one of the highest rates of child poverty in the country.
Bobby Lee.
But instead of ensuring they don't go hungry, the Conservative government of Saskatchewan wants to use the Notwithstanding clause to save a policy a judge would said it was causing irreparable harm. Is that what Conservatives stand for, dividing people and trampling on human rights? That doesn't sound like common sense to me. Now, will the government do everything they can to stop the harm against Canadian children?
Bolo. Good question.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you for this very important question. We're fully aware
of the
government of Saskatchewan's proposed use of the Notwithstanding Clause. We are dead set against the preemptive use of the Notwithstanding Clause in any circumstances. The Notwithstanding Clause is intended to protect minority rights, not suppress them. In light of the decision by the court of Saskatchewan yesterday, we would have thought that the government of Saskatchewan would have taken a moment to pause, reflect, and wait until the process played itself out. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Phony James Maloney.
The honourable member for Nunavut.
Phony baloney James. Phony baloney.
Homes
Phony
are
baloney James
supposed to be
Maloney.
where dreams are cultivated. For Inuit and Indigenous peoples, homes are overcrowded, molded, and spaces where dreams vanish. Children have no space to do homework.
It's a tough
Women
deal
have
for
no
the
space
natives,
to
for
flee
sure.
abusive partners. Inuit and Indigenous
Bad.
peoples have little to no space to take care of their mental well-being. This is the result of decades of liberal and conservative underfunding. When will the Liberals finally close this funding
question.
housing gap?
The honourable parliamentary secretary.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for her passion and for her question.
James Baptiste.
Our government is fully aware that in order to
Baptiste.
advance
It's cool.
reconciliation, we need to close the gap between Indigenous people and the rest of Canada, as well as address the harms that is caused through colonization and underfunding. Our government is committed to doing that. We have a tremendous ability and record of first in our country for Indigenous people. We'll continue to make those progress, and I thank the member, and I look forward to working with her on the INAN committee together to do so.
We're getting to see a lot of different faces here.
Just a week ago, under this Prime
because
Minister's watch,
nobody
the
went to
Nazi
work
was
on
welcomed
Friday.
in this place and actually honored within this chamber.
Outrageous
Now, when
Thomas,
the Prime Minister should have been a statesman and taken full responsibility, instead he chose to flee and hide. Not just for 1 day, not just for 2 days, but actually for 5 days. For 5 days he was mute. For 5 days he watched as our reputation was tarnished. For 5 days he was in hiding. For 5 days. He utterly embarrassed our country. The Prime Minister has yet to take responsibility. Will he stand up, do the brave thing, and do that today?
I doubt it. He's not even there. Hanging out at his cabinet or something.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Jean-Luc.
The former Speaker has made it very clear that he alone was responsible for inviting this individual to the House and recognizing him. It was his initiative, and no other parliamentarians nor the government were involved. The former Speaker invited his own guests.
Look at
for
all the
Friday's
green seats,
address,
guys.
which were determined by him in his own office. No advance notice was provided to the Prime Minister's office nor to the Ukrainian delegation about the invitation or the recognition. There are many Canadians who are hurt by this, and this mistake has been especially difficult for Jewish, Ukrainian, and
The honourable member for Lethbridge.
Member proves my point. It's the Prime Minister of Canada. He is meant to function as a statesman, to take personal responsibility when a mistake happens.
Yeah.
And yet, instead, he chose to flee. He chose to hide.
Cowardly.
Coward, you know?
Why? Why? Why not take personal responsibility? Why not remedy this on the world
Why?
stage? Why not acknowledge the grave atrocities that have taken place in our history and the mistake that was made
good
here
question,
in this
Rachel.
House and the impact that that would have on Canadians? So I'll give him an opportunity today. Would he honorably stand up, take that personal responsibility, and apologize to Canadians?
She's giving you the opportunity.
The honourable minister.
You're not going to take it?
Thank
Oh,
you,
no,
Madam
you're
Speaker.
playing hooky.
Again, the former Speaker has made it very
me
clear
out.
that he alone was responsible for inviting this individual to the House and recognizing him. It was his initiative, and no one in this House knew of that. The Prime Minister, the same day we learned of this horrendous incident that occurred in the House, the Prime Minister recognized on the same day that this was painful for Canadians and communities who were affected by the Holocaust.
One of my pet peeves is when they read from the paper. They've got 30 seconds of information to
Yesterday,
pass
in the
on.
Finance Committee, this government's own department told the Finance Committee that in fact in 2018 they warned the Liberal government of an impending housing crisis, yet they did nothing. Incredibly, CMHC officials went on to say that the policies currently employed by the federal government are not sufficient to solve the housing problem. If in fact this government's own
Housing
department
problem's not gonna
doesn't
go
believe
away.
in this Liberal government, why should Canadians?
Why should Canadians? It's a good question.
Secretary
It's a
to the
good
Ministry
question.
of Infrastructures,
Whatever your name is, Peter.
community, housing, infrastructure, and communities. I knew there was one in there.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would remind my honourable colleague to look at the actual record and to look at the actions of that opposition leader, who this summer while presenting himself as some sort of champion of the working class, stood in front of a Canadian's home, took a video, and called that home a shack. If he is serious,
Not a good look for
dealing
Polyev
with
there. It's a good one.
affordability and the housing crisis and the supply crisis that underpins it, I want to hear serious plans along the lines of what we've presented on this side. We're going to continue to fight for Canadians.
So I want to remind members, if they want to have conversations while answers and questions are being asked, they should take their conversations outside.
Be polite.
The honourable member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Madam Speaker, Canada's problems are real. We have incredible food bank usage. We have housing costs doubling. Millions of Canadians cannot afford their own homes, yet this side decides to play games. Back when the leader of the opposition was housing minister, housing was affordable in the country. So when will this government finally get serious, remove the gatekeepers, balance the budget so Canadians can keep their homes?
Good question.
Secretary.
Madam Speaker, he's quite correct. That side does play games. You know what else they do? They also vote against tax cuts for the middle class. They also vote against child care for kids. They vote against dental care for kids. Discussions of pharmacare are happening at this time. That side wants to entertain none of it. At a time when Canadians are facing real challenges of affordability, government can be there to help.
Good job,
this government
Peter.
has put serious measures on the table. It's having an effect. We're going to continue to do that. They should wake up and come to the party.
Come to the party, huh? Nice one.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Madam Speaker,
Here we go.
97%. That's
Nicole
the
Sullivan
share of
from
income
Mad TV.
a household would need to cover home ownership costs now in Vancouver. This from a new RBC report, which says housing affordability in most major Canadian cities is near all-time worst levels. The Prime Minister also holds the all-time record for incurring more debt during his 8 years than all other Prime Ministers combined. Housing is less affordable than ever. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister finally stop his inflationary spending so Canadians can keep a roof over their heads?
This inflationary spending, guys.
Secretary.
It's a problem.
I remind the honourable member, Madam Speaker, that Canada has the lowest deficit and debt in the G7. But times remain hard. We see that. We understand that.
Tough times
On
all over, I
housing
guess.
affordability, what are we doing? The supply crisis that underpins the housing crisis in front of the country is one that requires building. That's why we've lifted GST for the purposes of rental construction on apartments. That's why we've made changes to the borrowing limit of the Canada Mortgage Bond. I don't want to get into the technical details because they are vast. The result is more homes built for Canadians. That's what we're going to continue to do.
Where are these homes, though? Where are they?
Well, Madam Speaker, the OECD says in the G7,
Mad.
Canada has the biggest gap between housing prices and Canadian wages. The Finance Minister said her plan to bring down inflation is working, and yet it has soared to 4%. Mortgage interest costs have also soared now to 31%. So it's no wonder Mortgage Pro's recent survey showed 48% of young people say they've given up on ever owning a home. Now, this NDP Liberal government spending is driving up inflation,
Monopoly
which
money?
is driving up interest rates, which is driving up mortgage interest costs. Will the Prime Minister finally stop his inflationary spending so Canadians can keep a roof over their head?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Good question.
Here we go again, Madam Speaker. The contradictions just speak for themselves, but I highlight them for you.
All these contradictions.
In July of 2022, we had inflation at over 8%. That is now down to 4%. Certainly not low enough, but we see progress on that front, Madam Speaker. I also hear
It's not really progress. It's something slowing down, which I guess you could call progress.
In terms of affordability. Let's just take pensions, by the way. I've heard nothing from that side at all with respect to Premier Smith's pension plan that would deplete the fund by 53%. Combine that with their focus or lack of focus on EI, they voted against all these measures that will...
L'honorable député de Manicouagan.
The honourable member for Manicouagan.
All right.
Madam Speaker, let's talk
Marilyn
about
Gill.
Chalk River,
The Bloc
a
Québécois.
project to bury nuclear waste near the Outaouais River. The chiefs of several First Nations have joined their voices to a broad opposition movement in Quebec. They are concerned about the impact on the river. They are concerned that there will be a nuclear landfill near their sacred lands. They are concerned, but no one consulted them, which is a direct violation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. When will this government finally listen to them and put an end to the Chalk River project.
Indigenous people have a tough go, man. No doubt.
Madame la Présidente.
Bullshit.
Madam Speaker, Canadians' health and safety, reconciliation, and protecting the environment are all major priorities. When it comes to our nuclear policy, the project is currently being reviewed by the Commission.
This lovely lady doesn't look
And
like a
according to that
politician to
review,
me, though.
All nuclear waste in Canada is being
Does she
handled
look like a
safely
politician to
according
you?
to international standards in appropriate facilities, which are overseen by our world-class Nuclear Safety Commission. Thank you very much. The honourable member.
Here we go.
Madam Speaker,
Sticking up for the Indigenous.
First thing to do would be to at least give a minimum amount of respect to the concerns of First Nations. Chief Heyman from the Kibawek Nation has written to the Prime Minister and never got an answer. The federal government should at least pause the Chalk River project and ensure that First Nations are listened to. But at the very least, could Ottawa do the very minimum when it comes to a nation-to-nation relationship? It should at least respond to the letter from the Kibawek Nation.
It's true. The letter deserves a response, right? Somebody should respond.
Secretary?
Thank you.
Jamie Baptiste back.
Sure, I acknowledge that we have work to do on this file. I know that this is something that might be coming before the INAN committee, but we look forward to hearing from the chiefs, hearing from the opposite member, and working with them to ensure that we're fulfilling our obligations
Hopefully they can get some
and our duty to consult. Thank you.
Good work done.
The Honourable Selkirk into Lake Eastman.
We learned yesterday these Liberals are cutting another
All right,
$1
this guy's
billion
going to get fired up.
from our
Jamie Bazan,
forces.
don't
This
screw
is in
around.
addition to the $2.5 billion they already let lapse last year. But the Prime Minister has no problem on wasting taxpayer money and running up massive deficits on things like the $160 million for McKinsey, $54 million on the ArriveCan app, $20 million bonuses on the Bank of Canada of executives, and let's not forget they allowed $4.6 billion of abuse under their COVID programs. These Liberals waste money on just about everything except our military. Why does the Prime Minister only cut spending when it hurts our troops?
That's right.
The Honourable Minister for National Defence.
Good questions, man. Uh-oh, Billy Blair going to put us to sleep.
By years when they reduced defense
He just woke
expenditures
up.
below 1% of our GDP. But Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, we are committed to the significant and strategic long-term investments that will ensure that CAF continues to function as an agile, combat-ready force, capable of making tangible contributions and delivering on our commitments. And at the same time, Madam Speaker, we must ensure that all expenditures are carefully controlled so that each dollar produces real value for Canadians. Thank you.
Remarkably, a little-known fact, Billy Blair is only 42.
When they're not being
That's what
recognized.
politics does.
The Honourable Member Caribou Prince George.
This Prime Minister is failing our most vulnerable of Canadians. Our country is gripped in the worst drug and crime crisis in generations. And last night we learned that this Prime Minister and the BC NDP are using taxpayer dollars to fund a group that buys drugs on the black market and then hands them out on the streets of Vancouver.
What?
We can't get people into recovery.
Is that true?
But we can perpetuate their addiction and support organized
Is
crime.
that true? What are you saying?
When will this Prime Minister put a stop to his failed drug policy and finally take real action and end this crisis?
Get fired up.
The Honourable Minister.
Madam Speaker, I don't think there's a single member of this House that doesn't mourn the tragic loss of anyone in this overdose crisis.
Dara Sachs.
But I have to say, Madam Speaker, to the member across the way, spreading misinformation about and conflating harm reduction and treatment loses lives rather than saving them. Madam Speaker, the provinces are responsible for providing safe supply, prescriptions, to clients who need help as they go through recovery. Madam Speaker, on this side of the House, we will continue to save lives. They should get
Hopefully
on
they
board
save
with us
lives.
with that, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member Sturgeon River Parkland.
I don't know if Todd is, if any of what he just said was true or what she said was true.
Victims and their families are not a priority. Correctional Services Canada, with the full knowledge of this government, transferred Canada's most notorious killer to a medium security prison. Public safety officials even wanted to keep
was
it
a bad
quiet,
one.
and victims' families were only notified after the fact. At committee, Conservatives are calling for this government to let victims' voices be heard, but the Liberals are refusing to allow it. Why is this Liberal government trying to cover up this outrageous affair, and why are they shamefully blocking the voices of victims from being heard?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Good piece, Dane.
Speaker,
Here we
it's
go.
clear that member
Phoebe's in the
opposite
house.
is distancing himself from the truth once again. In fact, all members of the committee came together to bring forward.
I'm sorry.
Phoebe needs it to be a quiet floor. It's too much.
So I think that,
Previous minister did as well, frankly.
What are they arguing about?
Order. I
Order.
think all members on all sides actually have used
takes
these things. So I
everybody.
just want to say I want to ask members to please be careful with their words, and you can't do indirectly what you can't do directly. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Madam Speaker, let me clarify the facts for the member opposite.
She got fired up.
What
Phoebe got
happened
fired up
at
in a
Public
couple of
Safety
minutes.
Committee was that all members of the committee came together to come forward to do a study on putting forward the rights of victims of crime, to look into how reclassifications are handled and how transfers are handled. And you know what happened, Madam Speaker? The Conservatives voted against it. They talk tough in front of the cameras, but when it comes to act, they do nothing.
Well. Good
The
for
honourable
you.
member for Beauce. Madam Speaker, after 8 years, the Liberals still don't seem to understand how to help our farmers, who are the ones who put food on our tables. With their partners in the Bloc Québécois, they seem to prefer forcing families into the street instead of getting rid of the carbon tax. In fact, they would like to see it radically increased. They are feeding the inflationary fire. They want to make the cost of living even higher. When you vote for the Bloc, you pay a high price. When will the Liberal Bloc coalition put an end to the infamous carbon tax and finally listen to our common sense Conservatives?
It's a good
The
question.
Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to remind my honourable colleague that federal carbon pricing does not apply in Quebec. Quebec, for many years, has had its own cap and trade system. I'd also like to remind my colleague that common sense is certainly not to ignore the impacts of climate change on our farmers throughout the country, especially in Quebec. I often meet farmers who are experiencing the impacts of climate change, drought, too much heat, not enough heat, pests. We haven't heard
So
anything
many
from the Conservatives
issues.
about what they would do to help our farmers face these problems.
What would they do?
The Hamilton Community Foundation's Vital Signs report says that for every new unit of affordable housing built, Hamilton is losing 23 units. It also confirms what tenants have already always known, that corporate landlords are evicting tenants to jack up the rents at a record rate while leaving Hamiltonians out in the cold. This Liberal government is leaving people to fend for themselves while big developers are cashing in on what's left of our city's rental apartment buildings. So, Madam Speaker, will this government adopt our NDP affordable housing plan to create an acquisition fund to save the affordable rentals left in Hamilton?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Madam Speaker, I know that member has a passion for dealing with homelessness and
All right,
addressing
guys.
issues of
We've got
affordability
one
more generally.
quick technical
This government has
issue here to try to fix up. And
put
there, we should be good.
substantial investment forward through the National Housing Strategy to combat homelessness. It is a difficult challenge for sure, but one that we're getting results on. It's not over, that fight continues, and combined with efforts to build more, lifting GST from rental construction, for example, the changes to the Canada Mortgage Bond borrowing limit. All of these things combined, and the bottom line is we're going to see more homes built, and affordability is the result from that. Mr.
He's saying the same line a couple of times now. Do you think they're building enough
Maybe
houses?
the honourable member heard my question, but clearly he wasn't listening. Because if he were, he would know that the winter months are approaching and that it's going to be life or death for the increasing number of people who are being left onto the streets to live in tent encampments. Cities like Hamilton are facing double-digit property tax increases in order to fill the crucial gaps in funding for social housing. In Hamilton, that's a 7-year wait list. This is life or death, Madam Speaker. So will this government immediately respond to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities' demand for direct funding in order to repair existing social housing units in order to address our 7-year wait list?
Go get him, Matt.
Madam Speaker, we have been there for cities like Hamilton and other Canadian cities and
Tired of
towns
Peter already.
through programs like Reaching Home, through the Rapid Housing Initiative, and in other ways to help not-for-profits that are on the ground doing the very hard work. I know that member cares obviously very much about this issue. I'm happy to have further discussions with him, but I go back to the point that we're going to advance issues around this by collaboration with the private sector, with the not-for-profit sector, with municipalities as well. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Northwest Territories.
All right.
Madam Speaker, tomorrow is National Day for Truth and
Michael
Reconciliation.
McLeod,
It's a day that recognizes First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children who were separated from their families, their culture, and their communities. While the Leader of the Opposition fails to advance on Indigenous issues such as UNDRIP, which he voted against, our government will be there to work with Indigenous peoples. Can the Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, update the House on our government's record on reconciliation?
Honourable
Good
Parliamentary
question,
Secretary to the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations.
James, he's
Madam
coming in.
Speaker, when it comes to Indigenous issues, the record of the Leader of the Opposition is almost as shameful as his comments.
Order.
It's a rowdy day. It's
Just
Friday.
want to remind members that we need to ensure that we have respect here in the House, and I know that the honourable members would like to hear the answers. The honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, when it comes to Indigenous issues, the shameful record of the Leader of the Opposition on his voting is almost as shameful as his words where he said, instead of compensation for abuses suffered at the Indian residential schools, that Aboriginals need to learn the value of hard work. In contrast, our government has a record of historical firsts, the passing UNDRIP into law, the first ever Indigenous Language Commissioner, the first ever Indigenous Governor General, the first ever Indigenous Supreme Court Justice. I'll stand on record on our historic firsts every day, including
That
the
sounds
National
like a
Day
good
of
record.
Reconciliation.
If all of that is true, that sounds pretty good.
Again, there are some interruptions going on while members are speaking. Again, I would just ask members to please hold off to any questions they may have or thoughts. Order. 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 Again, if individuals want to have conversations, they should take them out. Order.
Let's get it together, guys. They're acting way out of hand. Come on. Order. Order.
If this continues,
This continues.
someone's going to end up losing a question. So,
Ooh. Sounds
questions
pretty
and
serious.
comments. The honourable member for Bow River. Oh, sorry.
Come on,
Calgary
lady.
Heritage.
8 long years of incompetent NDP Liberal government. Diplomatic disaster after diplomatic disaster. 1 in 5 Canadians are skipping meals. Crime, chaos, drugs, and disorder rage across our streets. A carbon tax making gas, groceries, and home heating more expensive. A tax that does nothing to achieve climate targets. A tax inflating everything, devastating everyone. When will the Prime Minister finally axe the tax?
People want to know. They're standing up.
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, last week during the United Nations Climate Ambition Summit in New York, I was at an event with West Kelowna's Fire Chief Jason Brolin. Chief Brolin vividly described the trauma of fighting this summer's massive wildfires, of sending his team into danger, of fighting to protect homes and lives. It was a miracle that no one died in Kelowna. He called it a once-in-a-lifetime fire, but then told us it was the second once-in-a-lifetime fire he has faced in 20 years. That's the impacts of climate change, Madam Speaker.
Climate change is serious, guys.
After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, Alberta
Love this
farmers
guy.
and families are paying
Monopoly
more
man.
tax than ever. When you tax Stamp Seeds that grows the food, Reimer Trucking that ships the food, Droz Farms that processes the food, Sunterra Market who sells the food, you're taxing everyone who buys the
true.
food.
It's a good point.
This Prime Minister is just not worth it. Alberta farmers need to keep feeding the world. Will the Prime Minister axe his carbon tax?
Doesn't look like he's going to, though.
Honourable Minister Minister.
Looks like he's putting it up.
Madam Speaker, we've seen the impact of climate change
Billy Blair,
devastating
oh, no.
on provinces right across this
Don't make
country
him stand
and
up.
impacting most significantly our farmers. In winter, we saw record cold temperatures leading to damaged homes, businesses, and crop results. Canadian farmers are on the front line of climate change, and that is exactly why, Madam Speaker, we're investing nearly $500 million in programs like the Agricultural Technology Program and the Climate Solutions Program, and we'll continue to do everything that is necessary to help our farmers deal with the increasing effects of climate change. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Billy's hooked on the pad, man.
Honourable Member for Montmagny-Lisleck, Kamouraska,
notepad.
Rivière-du-Loup. Madam Speaker, the Bloc is doing its best to convince Quebecers that the carbon tax has no impact in Quebec. Nothing could be further from the truth. Everything that is transported from one province to another and ends up in our stores costs more because of this tax. Everything, including voting for the Bloc, is more expensive. After 8 years of this government, many Quebecers are feeling the pinch. Will this Prime Minister finally cancel this costly Bloc Liberal tax?
So what's the deal there? Did the Bloc vote with the Liberals to push through the
Minister
carbon
of
tax? That must have
Transport.
been what happened, because he's saying that.
Madam Speaker, I find those
The most
attacks
interesting
on the Bloc
man
very
in the
mean.
world.
But if the Conservatives had any interest at all in the economy in Quebec, they would have highlighted the historic announcement yesterday. We're going to create 3,000 jobs. We're going to look to the future and produce the greenest batteries in the world, Madam Speaker. 3,000 direct jobs, many more indirect jobs, green batteries in cars around the world, and they're not even talking about it. That's what the Conservatives are about. They don't care about Quebec at all.
The
Those
The
Ackies.
honourable member for Montmagny-Lisleck, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Madam Speaker, the Bloc said it wanted to radically increase the carbon tax, while the Liberals granted their wish. There's a second carbon tax that also applies in Quebec. According to the Parliamentary Budget
gonna be
Officer, it will
expensive
add
there, man.
17 cents to the price of a litre of gasoline. The Bloc Liberal Alliance is always looking to dig deeper into Quebecers' pockets.
That's a
It
shitty
doesn't make
alliance.
any sense, Madam Speaker. Will the Prime Minister put an end to his inflationary taxes? The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change.
Come on,
Thank
Steve.
you, Madam Speaker.
Come on.
In 2023, it's unbelievable and even immoral that a political party that wants to form the government has nothing to say about climate change. When tens of thousands of people were displaced this summer because of forest fires.
It's a good
we
point.
could smell the smoke in New York and even in Europe. And the official position of the Conservative Party of Canada was that climate change don't exist.
Is
When it
that
costs
true?
Tens of billions of dollars
that their stance?
to Canadians.
It doesn't
It's scandalous,
exist?
Madam Speaker.
This is why we're here,
The
guys. This is
Honourable
what we're
Member for
learning
Berthier-Masquinongé.
about.
Madam Speaker, it's very concerning what Radio-Canada has revealed about the closeness between the big GMO companies and the federal government. They're so close that they play on the same team, dubbed the Tiger Team. A team of lobbyists from giants such as Bayer, but also federal officials who allegedly drafted the genome editing regulations together. It's worse than the fox in the hen house. It's the fox in charge of the hen house.
Good line.
Will the government mandate truly independent experts to re-examine all the regulatory changes made under the Tiger Team?
He's reading from a sheet.
Minister for National Defence.
Oh, God. Billy Blair doesn't even think twice. Read from the sheet.
Organic, conventional, and seed sectors to find new food production solutions to feed the world's growing population. It is common practice for the government to actively engage with implicated stakeholders when discussing regulatory matters. The Tiger Team process was intended as a time-limited mechanism through which multiple stakeholders in the grain supply chain would have an opportunity to provide their views on a very complex topic of plant breeding and innovation. And Madam Speaker, we will continue doing all that we can to support Canada's farmers and farm families.
Sounds good, Billy Blair, but I
Honourable
don't know.
Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Madam Speaker, it makes no sense to let the people who make money from a product decide the rules that apply to their product.
It's a good
It's
point.
even worse when we're talking
Very
about
good point.
food and people's health. How can we let a company like Bayer write the rules on GMOs and genome editing?
It is
we now
frustrating
need to
to hear
reassure
that
people
could be
there's a
true.
breach of trust. Only a rigorous review of the regulatory update by truly independent experts can repair this total lack of judgment on the part of the government. When will it launch this review?
Good question, man.
The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague for his question. This is why myself, the former Minister of Agriculture and Health, have worked together to put in place the reforms he's talking about. That's what led to the federal government's announcement that there will no longer be pesticides used on federal lands, which led to a review of the way we approve pesticides in Canada, and that we allow more independent scientists to look at the review of each of these pesticides. We are undertaking that review that the honourable colleague is asking us to do. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
For Miramichi Grand Lake.
Madam Speaker, Atlantic Canadians are struggling
Cousin
to
Alan
pay for
looks
their
just like this
groceries,
guy.
gas, and home heating. Meanwhile, the Atlantic Liberal MPs support measures to quadruple the carbon tax to 61 cents a litre. Atlantic Liberal MPs have continued to support carbon taxes since 2015. Will the Atlantic Liberal MPs vote on the Conservative motion next week to axe the tax so Atlantic Canadians can afford gas, groceries, and home heating?
It's expensive out here, guys, man. Like, gas is pricey. Oil, worse.
First, important question. Madam Speaker, let's talk about what's important for Atlantic Canada. Earlier this week, I stood here and listened to Conservative and Atlantic Conservatives from Atlantic Canada vote and are voting against the Atlantic Accord that gives Canada an opportunity, gives Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador an opportunity to find prosperity and also meet our green goals. Madam Speaker, I'm hoping that they vote for the Atlantic Accord and those changes to help Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada. Thank you.
The honourable member for Miramichi Grand Lake.
Madam Speaker, they've already ruined one tidal project, and I invite the member opposite to tell the people of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia choosing between fueling their car and purchasing groceries how the carbon tax is not punishing them every single day. Atlantic Liberal MPs allege they are not in favour of the carbon taxes while back home, but have supported it 23 times since 2015. Again, they claim that they now are against it. The carbon tax, will they put their money where their mouth is and vote next week to axe the tax?
Axe the tax. Hey.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change.
I would like to remind my honourable colleague that his party campaigned on putting in place a price on pollution in Canada in the 2021 election. But what I find interesting, and I would like to pick on what my colleague was saying, why is the Conservative Party opposing the development of clean energy in Canada? Like the moratorium that Premier Smith has put in place in Alberta, which is putting at risk $30 billion of investment in renewable energy in the clean technology sector. Thousands of jobs are at risk. Will the Leader of the Opposition stand to this House, Madam Speaker, and explain to us whether or not he supports clean energy or not?
Yes, I know the honourable members there. I just want to remind members to please keep the tone down while someone else has the floor.
They're rowdy today.
The honourable member for Regina, Wisconsin.
They're rowdy in the House. They're all pissed off that their
Food Banks Canada,
co-workers played hooky.
7 million Canadians are struggling to put food on the table. That's because farmers pay the carbon tax on the food they grow. Truckers pay the carbon tax on the food they transport. Grocers pay the carbon tax on the food they refrigerate. And all of those carbon taxes get passed on to the consumer. Madam Speaker, will this Liberal NDP government cancel its plan to increase its inflationary carbon tax?
Increasing the carbon tax. Imagine increasing the carbon tax. Like, it couldn't get much worse than